Secondly, is we agree with the proposals for the ceasefire, but our position is based on the assumption that the ceasefire would lead to a long-term peace, something that would remove the initial reasons for the crisis. As for the readiness of Ukraine to ceasefire, there's a meeting between Americans and Ukrainians in Saudi Arabia, and it looks like a decision that is taken by Ukrainian side under American pressure. In reality, I am completely convinced that Ukraine had to ask Americans, insist on this, based on the situation on the ground.
All right, so in the least surprising news that we've had in quite a while, Vladimir Putin just rejected the U.S. ceasefire proposal that was previously accepted by Ukraine. Now, something that I think is worth harping on here, just to make sure it is perfectly clear, there were no conditions for this ceasefire. It was exclusively stop killing each other, no more death and destruction, no more Russian missiles and drones raining down on Ukrainian cities, no Ukrainian drones hitting Moscow like they did a couple days ago for 30 days. That was it. The idea here from this U.S. proposal was a 30-day pause in the fighting and the killing to allow Ukraine and Russia to come to the table and try to make some sort of progress towards a negotiated end of this conflict. Maybe that would have happened, maybe it wouldn't have, but that was it. It was just try to stop killing each other for 30 days. And to that, Russia, as we just saw with President Putin, said no. Now, I think it's worth keeping this in mind because we've heard for quite a while now from a lot of, I'll say, Russia sympathizers. I think it's maybe a stretch too far to say Russia supporters, but they'll say the impediment to peace in this war is Ukraine. They're the ones that don't want peace. We heard this after President Zelensky left the White House. Remember the confrontation between Zelensky and notably Vice President Vance, but also President Trump there. And people said this is the problem, is Zelensky doesn't actually want peace. Ukraine doesn't want peace. They want to keep fighting. Well, what we just saw play out over the last couple days was the United States presented a proposal to Ukraine for a 30-day ceasefire to begin the process of ending this war, finding a negotiated settlement. Ukraine said yes. Russia said no. The reason this ceasefire is not moving forward is exclusively because of Russia. Now, what I've seen from some of those, we'll call them Russia sympathizers recently, is a bit of a move of the goalpost. So it used to be that Ukraine is to blame for not coming to the table and coming up with some sort of ceasefire agreement. Well, they just did. Now I'm hearing more and more, well, why would Russia want a ceasefire when they're winning the war? And they're pushing on all fronts. It's different rationale than there was just, 48 or 72 hours ago. Now let's go ahead and dive into some of the statements from Russian President Vladimir Putin during the speech today. First off, he pushed back saying that Russia demands guarantees that during the course of this 30-day truce, Ukraine will not conduct mobilization, training, or receive any weapons, which of course is kind of a non-starter, especially because the United States announced just a couple days ago that with this truce in place, should it go into effect, the United States was ready to turn all these things back on. In fact, from my understanding, they turned all this back on simply because Ukraine said they were ready for a ceasefire. Here, have a listen.
That, and I think as a result of this positive step forward, the president has decided to lift the pause on aid and on our security assistance to Ukraine going forward, and that's effective immediately.
Then turning back over to some key statements here from Vladimir Putin, he says, are we supposed to just let the Ukrainian armed forces leave the Kursk region after so many crimes against civilians? Notably, just yesterday, he labeled all Ukrainian forces, to include any foreign fighters in the Kursk region, as terrorists, which will have implications as to how they're treated. That hasn't really mattered in the past. Russia, we've seen increasing evidence in recent months that Russia is executing more Ukrainian POWs than at any point during the war, labeling them terrorists, kind of suggests that that is probably going to happen more in Kursk. Not that they domestically needed any justification, given how much that's happened recently. But Putin continued saying, will these 30 days be used to continue forced mobilization in Ukraine, as though he's concerned about the Ukrainian people? Remember, that's his concern first and foremost here. He says, how will the issue of control and verification be resolved? Who will determine the peace along the 2,000 kilometers of the front line, and who violated what? Now, I should mention there that the United States and Europe and multiple countries in Europe have now offered up European peacekeepers operating under a non-NATO mission. So these countries would be members of NATO because much of Europe is, but they wouldn't be operating under Article 5 is kind of the idea that's been thrown out there. And Putin and Russian leaders and his foreign minister, Lavrov, have come out on multiple occasions and said that is off the table. That is a non-starter. That is an escalation is actually a term they've used. So you have Putin saying now, well, wait a minute, who's actually going to be monitoring this is a little bit funny. He says Russian forces are advancing almost everywhere. It's unclear how the situation at the front will be handled in the event of a truce. So again, we're hearing that from some of the Russian sympathizers at this point, where last week it was Ukraine is the key impediment to peace, and today it's, wait a minute, Russia's advancing. Why would they want to stop this war if they're continuing to advance? Now, he does say a couple things here where he says the idea of ending this conflict peacefully is something we support, of course, only on Russian terms. And then he says he does not rule out discussing the idea of a truce in Ukraine with President Trump. And with that, I think it's worth going back real quickly here to highlight kind of what the United States said as these initial rounds of negotiations were wrapped up with Ukraine. We've got a couple different videos here from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Let's go ahead and play those.
As far as I am aware, the United States has not provided armaments to Russia. The United States is not providing assistance to Russia. Every single sanction that has been imposed on Russia remains in place. Every single sanction the president inherited remains in place.
Previous administration.
Right, but well, I mean, they're pretty sanctioned up. I mean, there's a lot of sanctions on already. My point being is that there's been no steps taken to relieve any of these things. These things continue to be in place, but we don't think it's constructive for me to stand here today and begin to issue threats about what we're going to do if Russia says no. Let's hope they say yes.
All right, so this is actually going to be really important. We're going to come back to this in a second when looking at what to keep an eye out for going forward. And a part of that is the carrot and stick in any sort of negotiation. And right now, all we've really seen is the stick applied to Ukraine and the carrot applied to Russia. That might change now that Russia very clearly is the one denying moving forward with the ceasefire. But in terms of that stick that we've seen applied, of course, aid was cut off for Ukraine for a period of time, as was intelligence sharing. We've seen the United States come out saying that Ukraine is a dictatorship. Zelensky is an illegitimate leader, if you will, needs to have elections and all sorts of things you wouldn't normally say about an ally. But we've done that to layer pressure on Ukraine with the idea, I think, of trying to push them into a position to actually negotiate an end to this war. On the Russian side, it's all been carrots, saying, well, maybe we'll improve our economic relations and we'll open up relations overall with Russia. Maybe we'll pull them back into the G7. Maybe we'll lay off some of these sanctions. Who knows? So we'll see how that changes now that it's pretty clear Russia is the only one of these two parties rejecting a ceasefire. And in looking longer term, let's go back to Secretary Rubio and how he views this overall peace deal.
Well, I think the point to understand is that we're looking at is securing their long-term. What we want to see, like any country in the world, Ukraine wants their long-term security. They want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. We all do. What is the point of spending all this time to get a ceasefire, hopefully, and then a negotiated end of the war, only to see it re-spark up again in about 6 years, 4 years, 3 years? We're not interested in that, and they certainly aren't either. So I think the question really is more about a deterrence. Can Ukraine create a sufficient deterrent against future aggression, against future attack, against future invasion? Because every country in the world has a right to defend themselves, and no one can dispute that. So that will most certainly have to be part of the conversation. But again, I don't think there isn't a peace to secure until you have a peace. But there's no way to have an enduring peace without the deterrence piece being a part of it.
All right, so the key point here that's brought up in multiple conversations around the ceasefire is not wanting this to be something temporary and wanting to make sure that peace actually sticks. The problem here is we have two very different ideas of how to get there. So from Ukraine's side, they're looking for some sort of security guarantee, like NATO membership is one item that they've thrown out time and time again. The idea that there are going to be serious repercussions if Russia tries to invade Ukraine again, or even restarts hostilities to a lesser degree. They have to be prevented from doing that. That is the Ukrainian side of the equation. On the Russian side of the equation, their take is this is only a temporary pause, and we can't have that. We actually need to achieve our overall war aims are still on the table. And Russia hasn't backed down from that. Just in recent days leading up to this round of negotiations in Saudi Arabia, Putin came out reiterating their maximalist aims, that Ukraine will be an independent nation. They will not join the European Union or NATO. That needs to be a hard decision that is made clear to Russia. There will be no European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine monitoring this situation after the war, and any sort of territorial concessions are off the table. What Russia has taken, Russia will maintain. No questions asked. So again, we have two very different views of how to put in place some sort of lasting agreement. Now, in terms of what to look for going forward here, there are three things to keep in mind or to watch out for. The first is some sort of Trump-Putin meeting, likely in the near future. Putin hinted at this, saying he's open to this conversation with U.S. President Trump. Trump has talked in the past about wanting to set up some sort of in-person meeting with Putin. They've, of course, had phone calls at this point. It feels like Putin is kind of holding out for that at this point. Before giving anything, he wants to make sure that he has this one-on-one meeting with President Trump. I would expect that now to have, be more in the conversation. From both sides, we've heard that this isn't necessarily planned. It's just in discussions. This might actually push that forward to happen here in the next few days or weeks. The second that we already hit on a minute ago is the pressure on Russia. What is the United States going to do now as President Trump and his administration is pushing for a peace deal, and they've seen Ukraine come to the table and say, we're open to a 30-day ceasefire, and Russia says no. So what now? What do we do to get Russia to a yes? I think that would mean more pressure. Now, there's a lot of sanctions already layered on Russia. I'm not entirely sure what we would do outside of that. Maybe add some additional ones, maybe sanctioning individuals, maybe ramping up arms shipments to Ukraine, but we'll see. You have to expect at some point here that the United States is going to ratchet the pressure on Russia. And the third one here to keep an eye out for are operations in Kursk. Now, this is a major issue for Russia. It's a thorn in the side of Putin and the Russian leadership, because if there was a ceasefire today, and it's some part of the negotiations, the front lines were frozen. That would be frozen with Ukrainian forces inside of Russian territory, which is clearly a problem for Vladimir Putin and a lot of people in Russia. So we've seen an uptick in operations there, Russian operations, trying to push Ukraine out for the last couple days now, and they've been largely pretty successful. But there is a real argument here that Putin is going to drag his feet until Ukrainian forces are entirely pushed out of Kursk, just because he doesn't want to roll the dice at all. And he wants to be able to come in with a much better negotiating position that is a bit hampered when there's actually Ukrainian forces holding on to some sort of bridgehead in Kursk. But personally, I'm kind of mixed here. Now, this was the closest we've come from the opening weeks of the war in finding any sort of actual end to the conflict. And that was a really, really big step. And it sucks to see Russia just shoot it down so quickly. On the other hand, maybe that door is still open. Maybe we'll get there. On the other hand, I think it's kind of a mask-off moment for Russia, for a lot of people. At least. It's not crazy that the Trump administration came in and said, maybe things will be different. If we treat Russia differently, if we approach this differently, if we bring forward different solutions, maybe we can get somewhere that the Biden administration couldn't. Now, I've been pretty skeptical of that, and I think anybody watching this channel has seen that for a while. There's been no real indications that Russia is actually ready for an end to this war on anything but their own maximalist terms. But up until today, Russia hadn't really been forced to state that explicitly. Now they have. So for better or for worse, a lot of people now know exactly who is on the other side of the negotiating table. But again, as of now, no ceasefire in Ukraine. We'll see what the next few days bring. That's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.